It's a fact of life. It happens, and it doesn't happen to bad people. It just happens to people. As I said, this is not about rejection. It's about sacrifice.
Well, hello and welcome back to Uncorking a Story. I'm your host, Mike Carlin, and today I'm very excited to introduce you to a returning guest, Ed Gangi. Before I do, I just want to reflect on something for a moment. Every so often I sit down with a guest whose story really does make me rethink the way I see the world. And today's conversation is exactly one of those. Part of the reason that it hit me is very personal. This one landed on a very personal level. My older brother Greg, who we lost to cancer just 2 years ago, was adopted at birth, and you'll hear Ed DeGangi talk about his adoption story as well. And there's a point during this conversation where I start to get emotional, and because grief just has a way of sneaking up on you when you least expect it. Greg would be turning 60 in just a few short weeks on September 5th. And I believe his death led to our mom's rapid decline. She passed away of congestive heart failure just 1 year and 1 month to the day Greg died. So he was June 21st, and my mother was July 21st, but a year later. And I like to think, she did die of congestive heart failure, but I really do believe that she died of a broken heart. It was just so hard for her. I mean, it's hard for all of us dealing with Greg's passing, but she and Greg had a very special connection. He was the first in the family. He started the family, if you think about it. And yeah, my mother just couldn't really get over his passing. But in addition to thinking about my mom, part of me couldn't help but think about Greg's birth mother. She found him much later in life. She tracked him down. God, he probably was in his 40s at the time when she tracked him down through the help of a private investigator. And I remember the night he took me to dinner. We went to the now closed Bennett's Steakhouse in Stamford, Connecticut. We went to Bennett's, and he sat me down. I didn't know. I knew he wanted to tell me something big. I had no idea what was about to come out of his mouth, but he told me that he had a very strange experience in the store. He ran a liquor store, and he had a very strange experience. He had someone come in the store. He got a really bad vibe from them, or some weird vibe, and he darted into his back room, had his manager deal with this person, and that person turned out to be his full biological sister. They tracked him down, and he got to meet her, and I guess he had two sisters, and I don't know if he ever came face to face with his mother or not. I do know that his sister would tell him things like, I say his sister, his biological sister, because we do have our sister Mia, who believes that she is his only sister, and she would argue that. But Greg's biological sister told her that every year on his birthday, their mother made a cake for him, and to me that there's a lot of heartbreak in that action, and you'll hear this reflected in Ed's story as well. But Greg and I, we really didn't talk about it that much after that night, at dinner at Bennett's Steakhouse. And I know he was thankful for his birth mother's sacrifice, but I never got the sense that he wanted to have a relationship with her. Um, and I don't know if that was disinterest on his part, or if he just felt it would, somehow betray our parents. And, unfortunately, I'll never know. But all of this was on my mind as I spoke with today's guest, Ed DeGangi, who was adopted at birth himself. He didn't start searching for his own birth mother until he was 69 years old. And there was a really interesting backstory to what prompted him to want to do that. That search led him to uncover a very remarkable story of his birth mother, and it led to his first book. Which was the gift best given. And now he came back to talk about a follow-up memoir called Gliding Through Goodbye, which is it's really very creative. It's a work of deep empathy, I would call it. where he imagines his birth mother's diary in the years after placing him up for adoption. And that was actually informed by interviews he did with women from the baby scoop era, women who found themselves in a very similar situation to his mother. So, hey, sit back and relax because this is a conversation about it's about family, it's about sacrifice, and it's about those quiet burdens that people carry for decades. So here we go. Let's uncork Ed DeGangi's story. Edward DeGangi was adopted at birth in New York City. An only child, he made no effort to explore the circumstances around his adoption until at age 69, a visit to a cemetery where members of his adoptive mother's family were buried stirred his interest. This curiosity led to his first memoir, The Gift Best Given, and now he rejoins me on Uncorking a Story to chat about his new memoir, Gliding Through Goodbye. Welcome back to Uncorking a Story, Ed.
Mike, thank you so much for inviting me back. It's a privilege to be here.
Well, it's my privilege to speak with you, Ed. I really enjoyed our first conversation, but remind me, where does your story as an author begin?
Seriously, it begins in that graveyard in Jackson, New Jersey. Prior to that, I had a story published in my high school yearbook. I did some journal type work with interests that I had had along the way. At one point I was very much into showing Appaloosa horses, and I wrote some articles that got published about that. I'm a serious fly fisherman, have been published that way, but none of those were real seriously intended to be literary. But in Jackson, New Jersey, I was standing over a grave, and all of a sudden there was a book in front of me.
Yeah, tell me, what was that experience like? And had you ever had an experience like that before? I mean, I assuming this wasn't the first time you were at that cemetery.
No, it was not the first time we were at that cemetery, but it had been some time. I probably mentioned it the last go round, but I had just finished reading a book, probably for the third time, called The Lost: The Search for Six of 6 Million. And it was written by an author who decided to go on a journey to determine what happened to some distant relatives who perished in the Holocaust. And he knew the obvious answer, but he wanted the precise answer, which was where, when, and how did that occur. And the book just had me fascinated, just the journey that he went on. He's a very well-known person. He's an academic, and I suspect had a rather large advance to work with. And over a period of years, he went around the world twice searching out for this story. And it just fascinated me. And as we were standing over that gravestone, it was the grave of my adoptive mother's parents. I was standing there thinking, if it was that easy, and it was not easy, but if you could effectively go and find out the fate of 6 people who perished in the Holocaust, wouldn't it be fun to do some research and find out some real specifics about the family that I had known as my adoptive family? So when we left New Jersey, we came back to the library, the same library I'm sitting in right now, got on Ancestry.com, typed in my grandparents' names, and was rewarded with a very rich trove of information. And that was the second aha. As I sat there looking at that, I said, if it's that easy to find out information about them, then maybe it's time to pursue the identity of the woman who had placed me for adoption so many years before.
Yeah. And that, again, that led to The Gift Best Given, which I know we spoke about last time. I'm curious, Gliding Through Goodbye, what can you share with us about that?
Yeah, Through Goodbye was it came out of the writing of The Gift Best Given. As I wrote The Gift Best Given, it was the search for the woman who had placed me for adoption. It was a story of my search, the unexpected discoveries that I made. I found that my birth mother had been a celebrity performer in the big ice skating shows in the 1940s and the 1950s. So I learned the circumstances of her becoming pregnant with me, the circumstances that led to my subsequent adoption, and then had a pretty good head start on what she did afterwards. But in the process of writing this book, I developed a very profound appreciation for the journey that a birth mother who is going to place a child for adoption goes through. And the gift best given gave me the privilege of meeting a number of, well, many people in the adoption constellation, and many women who were in that same pre-Roe period, the baby scoop era, who had given up children. And I started doing interviews and saying, tell me what you experienced. And, out of these many women and some additional reading that I did, written by other women in the period, I found women who came from all places in life, economically, socially, racially. But what I found was they all experienced precisely the same thing. They talked about the shame that they felt and was imposed upon them, about the secrecy that they had to live with. And, there is not one who said, well, yeah, I just placed the child for adoption and moved on with my life. There was not one who didn't say at some point within their year, and some of these women had placed children 50 years and more prior. There was not a time I did not think of them and wonder, were they okay? Were they okay? And I know you've had a couple of people who've experienced that both from the birth mother side and from the adoptee side, and that was the universal thread. I had women who told me there's not a day that still doesn't go by. I've had others who said, well, it's on their birthday and at Christmas, I can't help but think of them. But that focus on that child remaining was always there.
Yeah, I mean it's a powerful thing. I mean, you give birth, you create a life. You're creating a life and you're giving birth to a life, and I can only imagine that's just a question. You I my brother, my older brother Greg, I'm sure we talked about this the last time, but he was adopted. My parents adopted him as a baby, and he was born to a teenage mom. And many years later, he never really, from what he told me, and he's we lost him a couple of years ago to cancer, but he never told me that he ever wanted to meet his birth parents or his birth mother. But one day, where he was working, he owned a store, a wine store in Connecticut, and this person came into the store. He got a really strange feeling around this young woman who came in. He immediately darts to the back of his store because he's just feeling so like he's got his spidey senses are tingling. So his manager, the manager he hired to run the store, he's like, intercept this woman, see what she wants, and turns out it was his biological sister. The birth mom used a private investigator to track him down, because and then subsequently I don't know if he ever met his birth mother or not, but I know he did have a couple of interactions. He had two full biological sisters, and same thing though. They said that on your birthday every year our mom made a cake, and she always wondered, what happened to you, and his response
So the
was,
sisters were aware of him.
their sisters were aware of him. Yeah, the sisters were aware of him.
Okay.
But his response was, "Hey, she did the best thing she could ever do for me, because the family he wound up with was the." I'm getting emotional now, Jesus. But the family he wound up with was, and I guess I'm patting myself on the back, but the greatest gift he could have, right? He was, he was very close with my mom and dad. So yeah, but it sounds like you heard very similar things.
Yeah, very much so, but I'm convinced that my birth mother told nobody. 8 years after my birth, she did marry. She subsequently had two sons. One of them no longer with us, the other living down where he grew up in southern Georgia. And when I finally had a chance to meet him, it took the longest time to explain and for him to wrap his head around what I was telling him. He could not imagine that his sainted mother, you know, had a child out of wedlock, and I thought it was kind of a precious thing that he held her in such high esteem. But I'm convinced, right down to my bones, that there was nobody save for her eldest sister and her sister's husband who who helped her and shepherded her through the pregnancy and the adoption that she ever told. And I've met cousins, and my first question has always been, "Tell me what you know about my adoption." And to a person, they shake their head no. And they said, nobody knew anything because if one person in this family knew, the whole world would have known.
Right.
And so I think she went to the grave, she took the secret with her.
Yeah. I imagine that must have been a
And
tremendous
that's,
burden on her.
it had to be a burden on any woman, to carry that secret for any period of time. And they did it because, some place or someone was constantly driving into them. You did something wrong, you did something bad, and they didn't want to discuss it. And that's very much what the second book is about. I wrote that as a recreation of her diary in the years between the time that she relinquished me and the time she finally made the decision to marry. And she fought I think an emotional battle there, but it traces her professional travels as she toured as an ice skater, and it also recorded her emotional journey. And it was based upon all of those interviews that I did. I had several pages of notes that she had written, but they were useful more as a style guide and how she would have written the diary than for their content, even though there were some things in there that were very valuable. But she became a composite for all those other women out there. So the book was intended as a tribute to her and a tribute to those women.
Yeah. How forthcoming were these women, and how did you identify like who to talk to as part of this? Because I imagine someone getting a call from some random guy saying, "Hey, I want to talk to you about giving up a child for adoption." I'm sure your approach had a little bit more finesse than that, Ed. But I'm just curious how you found them and how they reacted to you.
Yes, it was more subtle than that, uh, but everything with this adoption and the reunion and the research had to be subtle because you hear about people who just sort of kick down the door and say, "Hi, I'm here," and that typically scares people away. But there were many women that I met from groups online. There were women who I met through their writings. I think you've interviewed before one of my friends, Laura Engel, who wrote
Oh yeah.
"You'll Forget This Ever Happened." And those women, once they understood what I was asking and why I was asking it, were so courageous and so generous with their information. And there were women who said, "I have never talked to anybody about this before, and it feels good."
Yeah, I imagine it's healing.
So it's
I imagine it's healing.
it is. I belong to a book club, and I think normally we have 14, 15 people at any given month. And our last meeting, there were only 9, and there came a discussion about a child who was fathered by someone other than his mother's husband. And the husband and the mother reunited. And the discussion came up is, do you tell this child what his background is? And everyone kind of just looked, and there were some opinions. And then one lady said, as the mother of adoptees, I believe, yes, you do. But Ed is an adoptee. Why don't you let him talk? So, I sort of gave my opinion, but then a lady next to me who only last month had come to me and told me her story as a teenage birth mother. For the first time, she said, in a crowd, spoke up and said, "I have something to add." And she told her story. And there was a lady sitting next to her who I had interviewed previously, also a birth mother, who sat quietly. She was sort of letting everybody else just take the conversation over. She didn't really want to talk about it. But that's 4 out of 9 people closely touched by adoption. But as I said, these women who I interviewed were very generous with what they told me and with what they revealed. And it was done on the basis of I'm not going to use your names. What I need are your experiences. And some of them I had very, very long conversations with. Some I continue to correspond with and talk with.
Anything did anything they share with you surprise you at all, or were you, anything you didn't expect to learn that you'd wound up learning?
I didn't 100% know what to expect. I expected to some degree that there would be a reluctance to talk openly. And that went away very quickly. Once they started talking, it was just sit back and I was taking notes. And the other part was I was surprised by how they talked about the frequency with which they thought of their birth child. And more of them thought about that child on a weekly or even a daily basis than did only once a year. As you said, your brother's experience was his mom baked a cake a couple of times a year. Some of these women every day, when they went to sleep, said a prayer, or when they woke up thinking about a child that they did not raise.
I imagine. And then, just the fact that you mentioned that they, you know, rarely talk about it. They rarely talk about it in the open. It's a secret. It's a source of shame. And I know that this is generational because, and I don't even, I'd be curious to know if you'd had these conversations with people who gave up, children from adoption, in the post-Roe era, if you'd find the same, sort of storylines. I don't know. I'd be curious to know though, right?
I think
If
to a
that's
less, I
same
think
or,
to, yeah, I think to a lesser degree, Mike.
yeah.
I'm sorry, I was saying I think to a lesser degree. I think there is still a stigma to having a child out of wedlock, a stigma to not having the resources or the ability to parent that child. So I think there is a stigma there. Uh, and I'm sure there's the message of let's not talk about this. Let's get this done with and let's move on. And it's an awful burden to carry.
I can only imagine how it impacts so many different aspects of your life. When you're carrying that burden. Yeah, I just interviewed somebody recently who was the victim of sexual abuse when he was a young man, and he had a really interesting quote, which was that carrying the the burden, the shame around with him was almost harder than the abuse itself. But when he started to speak freely about it, he wrote a memoir. But when he started to process it and speak freely about it, it was like that burden was lifted somewhat. The wound is always going to be there, but there is like healing in the talking and the revealing of some big secret that you might be carrying around. Probably why therapy works so well, right? Just like voicing something out loud is part of the healing process.
Oh, I agree 100% with you. I would think that if you can't talk about it, whether it's an adopted child or whether it's a sexual abuse, you replay that over and over and over in your head. And I think if you can talk about it, then you've got an outlet there and it's not just you. And I think most people will find that if they talk to the right people, the shame starts to go away because people are more sympathetic or empathetic than they are judgmental. And I think in all cases, you've got to pick your audience. Yeah, you need to find somebody who's understanding and impartial, but I think once you can release your experience and talk about it, I think it's got to be a better thing.
Yeah. I'm curious. I know, you had your first book was The Gift Best Given, and now you've got book number 2 out. What did you Well, I just compare writing the second book with writing the first. I'm sure you've I'm curious if it came easier to you than writing the first book because you've already written one before, or like how, what did you learn from writing the first one that you applied to the second?
It came with more difficulty, honestly. The first one, it was a case of not knowing what I didn't know. So I said, I'm going to sit down and write a book, and damn it, I did it. And it was kind of a linear story. It had a start and it had an end point, and all of the pieces of that book took me to that end point. And coincidentally, the book started in that cemetery in Jackson, New Jersey. It ended in a cemetery in Jackson, Georgia, where we interred my birth mother, because I had discovered that though she had passed away 3 years prior to my search, she had never been interred. So the ashes were with my half brother. So it's kind of that was good. That was a perfect story arc, and it took me to real closure there. The second book, as I said, had two purposes. One is I wanted to pay tribute or recognize what she as a birth mother and what those other women had experienced. And I also sort of had a charge from my readers from the first book who said, we want to know what Genevieve did next. It was just kind of an innocent curiosity. She had a very, very interesting career up to the point that she gave birth to me, and they wanted to know what happened next. And she returned to her ice skating career. She toured the United States and South America and Europe. So I was looking for something that would deal with both of those, and I had a couple of false starts, and ultimately decided I'm going to write a diary. And the diary was a little bit of a challenge because at first I started to write it in kind of in my prose. And when I read pieces to my writing group, the women especially said no woman would write a diary that sounded like that. There, it would have been a series of thoughts rather than lengthy sentences. It just, would have just whatever was she was thinking she would have put on paper. So I went back to those notes she had written, and I read through those over and over and really internalized them, and they were written in very short sentences. She was not much of a believer in conjunctions. She didn't use ands. She didn't use buts. She just put down a thought, put a period after it, and wrote the next thought. So I went back and I started to do this as a diary. I had the beginning of some good research anchors to tell me where she was, when she was there, and with whom. And I started to build around those. So the diary is her diary as I wrote it, as I imagined it, but it follows her place to place. And most of the entries, not all of them, have some reference to, I'm here in Paris, but I'm thinking about you. Some reference to, yeah, to that distant child who she's no longer raising.
Wow. That's an amazing exercise in empathy. Trying to put yourself in your mother's shoes and then thinking her thoughts, and trying to keep true to a historical timeline. It's I can only imagine. Did you feel closer with her after going through this?
I felt very close going in there. I felt closer coming out. But I think, as you said, I kept on challenging myself. Do I have a right to do this? And do I have a right to speak for her? And that was probably the hardest part, because I would go through and I'd say, okay, this is pretty good. And then I would say, but is it genuine? And I kept going back to those other women because they were the ones I could talk to. And I think it is good. It took a lot of convincing myself, but I think if she had written a diary, I think it would have been very authentic.
Yeah. Has anyone in her family had a chance to read this, and do you know what their reactions to it are?
They have not yet. There are a couple of cousins. There's, as I said, my half brother who didn't offer much input on the first book. He's not a big reader, but I will get the books in front of people. The book only came out the last week of June, so I haven't gotten an awful lot of feedback, but there was a consensus with the first book is you nailed your mother. You got her just right. And I think this book ties back to that one nicely in terms of where she was going, who the person was. So I think there'd be general consensus that, you've done it again.
Yeah, that's amazing. It's amazing. I tip my hat to you. That is it's a powerful exercise. What what you've got there. I mean, in both books, but particularly the second one where you're really trying to get into her mind, her persona. As I said, it feels like an amazing empathy exercise, which I think writing. Yeah, I think writers by nature are more empathetic given what it is we're trying to do. Like even in fiction, you're trying to make an audience feel something for a character, and to do that, you really have to step into the shoes of that character. Um, so it's yeah, I don't know. I'm very inspired by by what you've shared with me. Yeah.
Well, I hope that people see this as an empathetic exercise on my part, and I think more importantly, I would like to think that there are people who will become more empathetic because of it. Whether it's an adoptee who has always questioned why did his mother place him for adoption, and maybe look at it as this was what she did was a sacrifice rather than a.
Hmm. Well, also build a sense of empathy and understanding for the women who have to make these choices. Again, they talk about shame and feeling shame, and I mean, why hide something like this for so long? There's emotions, pre-birth, then there's emotions post-birth, and I think it just helps us just understand, hey, this is not necessarily something to be shameful about. It's part of our humanity. We've and let those of us who have sinned cast the first stone.
It's a fact of life. It happens, and it doesn't happen to bad people. It just happens to people, and and it's a terrible loss for these women. So to be sympathetic to that as well. Again, as I said, this is not about rejection. It's about sacrifice.
Yeah. Ed, where can people learn more about you if they're so inclined?
Well, I've got a website. It's at Gangi. It's DIGANGI author.com. And information on both books is there, a little bit of information about myself, a list of podcasts such as this one, interviews that I've done, and I'm so appreciative of the opportunities to have these conversations, and the book is available from the website. I'm happy to send out either a signed hard copy or an ebook from the website, or the book is available wherever you purchase your books, whether it's brick and mortar stores or your favorite online retailer. So both books are readily available at this point.
Very good. I'll put all link to the books and to your website in our show notes so people can find you easily, Ed. And I will say thank you for coming back to Uncorking a Story and letting me re-uncork yours.
Thank you so much, Mike. I really enjoyed chatting with you and enjoy the opportunity to talk about the book and the issue.
Thanks for listening to Uncorking a Story. If you'd like more information about today's guest or to find out more about Mike, go to uncorkingastory.com. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, rate, and review us at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Tune in every week to hear Mike Carlin uncork a new story.